The hedgerows of Normandy were supposed to be a minor obstacle, a few days' delay at most in the Allied race across France. That was what the planners in London promised. That was what the generals told their men as they loaded into landing craft on June 6th. Instead, those ancient walls of earth and root became a slaughterhouse for American armor. They became the graveyard where Sherman tanks went to burn. It was not because of German Tigers. The feared 60-ton monsters were rare in the bocage. It was not because of tactical failures. American commanders knew their business. It was not even because of the weather, or the terrain, or the 1,000 other excuses that fill after-action reports. The hedgerows became killing fields because no one had imagined them for what they truly were. 3,000 years of Norman farming had created the perfect defensive network. Each field had become a fortress. Each hedgerow had become a wall that might as well have been made of concrete and steel. But salvation came from the most unexpected place. Not from Detroit factories or Pentagon planning rooms. It came from steel teeth welded to ordinary tanks in an apple orchard behind the lines. It came from a sergeant who saw what the generals had missed. German defenders would later swear in prisoner interrogations that the Shermans had grown fangs overnight. They spoke of tanks that burst through impenetrable walls like they were made of paper. They described the moment their entire defensive doctrine became obsolete in a single morning. Was this the moment when American ingenuity, rather than industrial, might broke the Wehrmacht's spine? Was this when a cab driver from New Jersey succeeded where all the planning and preparation had failed? July 7, 1944, 0630 hours. The morning mist still clung to the ancient Norman hedgerows near Saint-Jean-de-Deye. Sergeant Bill Castile peered through his periscope and saw the same sight that had tormented him for a month. Another hedgerow, another earthen wall crowned with centuries of growth. Another death trap. For 30 days it had been the same nightmare. The Sherman would approach the hedgerow and try to climb. The moment its nose went up, its thin belly armor was exposed. The driver could not see. The gunner could not aim. For 30 seconds the tank was helpless. That was when the German 88 would speak. That was when the Panzerfaust would strike. 5 tanks lost for every hedgerow gained. At that rate they would run out of tanks before they ran out of hedgerows. But this morning was different. Castile felt the new weight on the front of his tank. 4 prongs of German steel taken from Rommel-owned beach obstacles and welded to his Sherman. They called it the Rhino, though it looked more like the tusks of some prehistoric beast. His driver had laughed when they first saw it. His gunner had made jokes about jousting. But the maintenance captain who supervised the modification had been deadly serious. This will change everything, he had said. The engine roared differently now, deeper and angrier with the added weight. Castile gave the order. The driver pushed the throttle. 20 miles per hour straight at the hedgerow. No slowing. No climbing. The steel prongs hit the earthen wall and kept going. They bit deep into centuries of compacted earth and root. The tank did not climb, it tore. It ripped through the hedgerow like a knife through canvas. In 5 seconds they were through. The German machine gun nest on the other side had no time to react. The crew was still turning their MG-42 when the Sherman bow gun cut them down. The Panzerfaust team, hidden in the corner of the field, did not even get to raise their weapon. The Sherman was among them before they knew the hedgerow had been breached. By noon, 12 German strongpoints had been overrun. Positions that had held for a month fell in hours. Panzer grenadiers who had fought at Kursk and survived the Eastern Front fled in panic. They could not comprehend how the Americans were coming through walls. They could not understand how their fortress had become a trap. The mathematics of defense had changed in a single morning, and no one had told them the new equation. The man who changed everything was Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen III. He commanded a light tank in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Before the war, he had driven a cab in New Jersey. He had no engineering degree. He had no special training in mechanics beyond what the Army taught him. He had only 2 things that mattered. He could see problems clearly, and he hated watching his friends die. The revelation came at a demolished German roadblock on July 2nd. The obstacle was littered with twisted steel beams that had once stood on Omaha Beach. Rommel had called them asparagus. They were meant to rip open landing craft and stop tanks on the sand. Now they lay abandoned and rusting in a Norman field. Cullen stood there studying them, while his crew ate cold rations. He picked up one of the beams and tested its weight. German steel, forged to withstand the impact of a 30-ton tank. Built to pierce and tear, that was when the idea formed. If these beams could pierce a landing craft, they could pierce a hedgerow. If they were strong enough to stop a tank, they were strong enough to be used by one. He turned to his driver and said 5 words that would echo through history. "Get me a welding torch." He did not ask permission from his captain. He did not file a request with the Ordnance Department. He simply took 4 of the German beams and supervised as his crew welded them to the front of their Stuart light tank. They worked through the night using a captured German welder. By dawn, they had created something that had never existed before. They named it Bow and Arrow, though it looked nothing like either. The first test came at sunrise. Cullen ordered his driver to hit the nearest hedgerow at maximum speed. The skeptical crew expected disaster. Instead, they watched as the steel prongs bit into the earthen wall. The tank did not climb. It did not expose its belly. It simply pushed through. 30 seconds to breach what normally took 30 minutes to climb. No exposure, no vulnerability. Just straight through like the hedgerow was made of cardboard. Word spread through the battalion within hours. By noon, Cullen was demonstrating his device to Colonel McHugh. By evening, he was showing it to generals. Within 3 days, the 1st Army Ordnance units were mass-producing what they now called Cullen hedgerow cutters. Within a week, hundreds of tanks were being modified. Within 2 weeks, it would become the most important innovation of the Normandy campaign. The generals would later call it brilliant. The engineers would analyze its perfect simplicity. The historians would write about American ingenuity, defeating German doctrine. But Cullen himself said it best in a letter home. He wrote that he was just tired of seeing good men die for no good reason. He wrote that sometimes the answer is right in front of you. You just have to pick it up and weld it to a tank. June 6th to early July had been a nightmare beyond anything the Allied planners had imagined. The intelligence failure was complete and catastrophic. Aerial reconnaissance had shown fields and roads and villages. It had not shown that each field was a death trap. It had not revealed that 3,000 years of Norman farming had created the perfect defensive network. Every hedgerow was 6 to 10 feet of compacted earth. Centuries of root systems had turned soil into something harder than concrete. Trees and thick brush crowned each wall. Between them ran sunken roads that became killing tunnels for tanks. The Germans had not built these defenses. They had simply recognized their value. One MG-42 team in a hedgerow could stop an entire platoon. A single Panzerfaust soldier could destroy a tank from complete concealment. They had turned each field into a kill box with pre-registered mortar coordinates. They measured distances and calculated angles. They waited. The statistics were bleeding the Allied army white. Advancing 100 yards cost 10 casualties. Gaining a single field might cost 3 tanks. At that rate, the mathematics were simple and terrible. They would run out of men and machines before they ran out of hedgerows. In the first month after D-Day, the Allies suffered 40,000 casualties. They had gained 5 miles. The same distance had cost more lives than the entire North African campaign. Sherman tanks had 3 options, and all of them were bad. They could try to climb the hedgerow, which exposed their thin belly armor, for 30 seconds of helplessness. They could try to blast through with their main gun, which rarely worked and told every German within a mile exactly where they were. They could wait for one of the precious bulldozer tanks to clear a path. But there were only 4 dozers per division, and the Germans had learned to target them first. The infantry had it worse. Without tank support, they had to storm the hedgerows on foot. Machine guns waited on the other side. Mortars had already calculated their crossing points. Every attack became a bloodbath. Young men from Iowa and Texas and New York died in fields that had been farmed since before Christ was born. Command pressure was breaking generals. Eisenhower faced daily criticism from Churchill, who wanted faster progress. Roosevelt asked uncomfortable questions about casualty figures. Bradley considered resigning after watching another failed attack. Montgomery lost 400 tanks in Operation Goodwood and had nothing to show for it. The press had begun using a word that terrified everyone: stalemate. The Germans grew confident. Hitler declared that the hedgerows were better than the Atlantic Wall had ever been. Rommel said each hedgerow was worth a battalion of defenders. German propaganda broadcasts called Normandy the New Verdun. They said America would bleed itself white in the bocage. The Wehrmacht could rotate units for rest because they had time. They had the defense. They had the hedgerows. Failed solutions littered the battlefield. Tank dozer blades worked, but there were too few and they broke too easily. Explosive snakes were too complex and attracted every German gun in the sector. White phosphorus cleared hedgerows temporarily, but caused friendly casualties when infantry tried to advance through the smoke. Flanking movements were impossible when every direction led to another hedgerow. The Allies had superior numbers. They had air supremacy. They had better logistics. None of it mattered in the bocage. The hedgerows neutralized every advantage. They turned modern mobile warfare into something from the First World War. They made technology irrelevant and casualties inevitable. Something had to change or the invasion would fail. Not from German counterattack, but from simple arithmetic. The hedgerows were killing the Allied army one field at a time. The impossible happened in an apple orchard behind the lines. No factories were involved. No production lines existed. There were only exhausted maintenance crews working with blowtorches and determination. The 1st Ordnance Battalion had been given an impossible task. Mass-produce a device that had been invented 3 days ago, using materials that had to be scavenged under enemy fire. Captain Steve Swain commanded the ordnance company that took on the challenge. He had 40 men trained to repair tanks, not redesign them. He had welding equipment, meant for patches, not major modifications. He had no blueprints, because Cullen had built his prototype by eye. He had no materials, except what could be stolen from German defenses. He had no time, because men were dying every hour the tanks stayed trapped in the hedgerows. The first problem was getting the steel. German beach obstacles had to be retrieved at night. Teams of engineers crawled onto the invasion beaches under darkness, dragging back the heavy beams. Railroad tracks were pulled from bombed French railways. Steel girders were cut from destroyed bridges. They even used armor plate from knocked-out German tanks. Anything strong enough to pierce a hedgerow without bending. Each cutter had to be custom-fitted. No 2 Sherman tanks were exactly alike. The British had different models. The angles had to be calculated for each vehicle. Too steep and the prongs would dig into the ground. Too shallow, and they would slide over the hedgerow instead of cutting through. The welding had to be perfect. A weak joint would snap on impact and probably get the crew killed. The work never stopped. Men welded in shifts through the night, using shielded lights to avoid German artillery spotters. The noise of torches and hammers mixed with distant gunfire. Tanks rolled in damaged from battle and rolled out with steel tusks. The apple trees provided shade during the day and concealment at night. The orchard became a factory floor covered in steel shavings and sweat. Production scaled up faster than anyone believed possible. 3 tanks on the first day, 20 by day 3, 50 per day by the end of the first week. The crews developed an assembly line without ever planning one. One team cut the steel to length. Another shaped the prongs. A third welded them to the tanks. A 4th tested the modifications on practice hedgerows built behind the lines. Quality control meant lives. Each cutter was tested before the tank returned to combat. They found that 4 prongs worked better than 6. The center prongs should be longer than the outer ones. The angle needed to be exactly 23 degrees from horizontal. Too many prongs and the tank bogged down. Too few and the hedgerow would not split cleanly. Every lesson was written in a field manual that grew day by day. The Germans remained ignorant of what was happening. They thought the modifications were for mine clearing. Radio operators spread false rumors about new tanks arriving from America. Commanders who saw the devices from a distance reported them as dozer blades. The secret held because everyone understood that surprise was everything. The first mass use had to be devastating, or the Germans would adapt. By July 25th, over 500 tanks had been modified. The British had created their own version for Churchill tanks. The Canadians developed a variation using salvaged German anti-tank obstacles. Even Stuart light tanks received smaller versions. The invention spread and evolved like a living thing. Each unit added improvements. Each crew had suggestions. The cost was essentially nothing. Scavenged steel and welding rods, labor from men already on the payroll. No contracts or procurement delays. No congressional approval needed. Just American soldiers, solving a problem with whatever they could find. The entire program from conception to mass deployment took 3 weeks. Detroit could not have done it faster. The Pentagon could not have done it at all. But maintenance sergeants working in an apple orchard made it happen because they had to, because their friends were dying, because the hedgerows would not wait for proper channels. The breakthrough became a rout within 48 hours. German units that had held their positions for 7 weeks fled in panic. Veterans of the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet tank armies, said they had never experienced anything like the Rhino assault. The Americans seemed to come through walls like ghosts. They appeared where they could not possibly be. The hedgerows that had protected now trapped retreating Germans between advancing American columns. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the remnants of Panzer Lehr, sent a desperate message to headquarters. Our entire defensive system has collapsed in hours. The Americans have made the hedgerows meaningless. We cannot hold any position when they come through every wall. His division that had entered Normandy with over 14,000 men and 100 tanks was reduced to scattered groups fleeing south. The pursuit phase began on July 27th. Patton's Third Army was activated with 300 Rhino tanks, ready to exploit the breakthrough. They covered more ground in 3 days than the First Army had taken in 7 weeks. German plans for counterattack became impossible when their assembly areas were overrun before units could gather. The carefully planned defensive lines existed only on headquarters maps. SS Colonel Heinz Guderian watched his battalion dissolve in less than an hour near Coutances. He later testified that the psychological impact was devastating. Men who had fought without breaking in Russia simply ran. They could not comprehend how the Americans were everywhere at once. The hedgerows had become transparent to American tanks, while remaining solid barriers to German movement. The race across France had begun. Villages that had been marked for week-long battles were liberated in hours. The German 7th Army found itself trapped in what would become the Falaise Pocket. 50,000 men caught between advancing Americans and British forces. They had nowhere to retreat, because Rhino tanks had cut every escape route through the hedgerows. Hitler raged at his generals, but could offer no solution. He had declared the hedgerows impregnable. He had based his entire western defense on holding in Normandy until wonder weapons could turn the tide. Now his armies were fleeing faster than headquarters could track them. Orders for counterattacks arrived at positions already overrun. Reinforcements found only abandoned equipment and dead comrades. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In 7 weeks of hedgerow fighting before the Rhinos, the Allies had advanced 20 miles at a cost of 100,000 casualties. In the 2 weeks after Operation Cobra, they advanced 200 miles, losing only 15,000 men. The German army in Normandy ceased to exist as an organized force. 200,000 Germans were killed, wounded, or captured. An entire army group was destroyed. By August 15th, Paris was in sight. The liberation came on August 25th, 3 months ahead of the most optimistic Allied projections. The Seine was crossed without a major battle. Belgium was entered in early September, all because a sergeant had looked at German beach obstacles and seen the answer to American prayers. The numbers revealed a revolution in warfare. 3,000 Rhino devices were produced by the end of August using nothing but scavenged materials. The cost was essentially zero compared to any military procurement program in history. No factories were retooled. No contracts were negotiated. No committees debated specifications. Just American soldiers with welding torches solving an impossible problem in 3 weeks. The strategic impact rippled across Europe. The German 15th Army, trapped in the Pas-de-Calais, could not move south in time to stop the Allied advance. V-1 launch sites were overrun before they could devastate London. Belgian ports fell intact, providing supply lines for the race to Germany. The entire Western Front collapsed 4 months earlier than German planning had assumed possible. Field modification became official doctrine overnight. Every unit was encouraged to innovate and share solutions. The Rhino's success inspired dozens of other adaptations. Mine flails were improvised from chains and steel bars. Flame-throwing tanks were created in motor pools. Bridge-laying equipment was fabricated from captured German materials. The American army had learned that innovation could come from any rank at any time. Eisenhower wrote in his official report that the Rhino saved 100,000 casualties. Bradley went further, claiming Kulin did more to defeat Germany than any division. Patton declared that American ingenuity had beaten German engineering. Montgomery quietly adopted the devices for British forces and claimed partial credit for encouraging innovation. The Germans never developed a counter. They tried to create deeper obstacles, but lacked the time and resources. Wire entanglements were added to hedgerows, but the rhinos tore through them. Mines were laid, but American engineers cleared them faster than Germans could plant them. The Wehrmacht had built its entire defensive doctrine on the assumption that hedgerows were permanent obstacles. When that assumption died, their strategy died with it. Recognition came slowly for the innovators. Sergeant Cullen received the Legion of Merit, but no promotion. He finished the war as a sergeant and returned to driving a cab in New Jersey. The ordnance crews who built the devices under fire received unit commendations. Most of the men who welded through the night to save their fellow soldiers remained anonymous. The lesson was clear and revolutionary. The best solutions often came from the bottom up, not top down. A taxi driver had succeeded where all the planners and experts had failed. He had looked at the problem with fresh eyes and seen what everyone else had missed. The German steel that was meant to stop the invasion became the tool that ensured its success. The hedgerows that were supposed to bleed America white became highways for American armor.